and I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and record this. I'm going to be talking about interpersonal neurobiology. I also call it relational. It's another word for interpersonal, and neuroscience, which is another word for neurobiology. So it's a framework for understanding ourselves and how we interact with the world. And it's really interesting, and what I've started doing is I have a relational neuroscience 101 class that I give here maybe every 6 weeks, and I have that on my website too if you want to know the fundamentals of relational neuroscience. But what I found really interests people is just kind of cherry picking kind of the interesting concepts from it and applying it in usable ways to people. So those are the talks that seem to be most popular. This talk today is I'm just going to randomly throw out different neurobiology principles that apply to eating. And then next week I'm doing a neurobiology for change course. And that's the same thing. It's the same principle. It's just we're looking at change instead of eating habits. And then I'm going to get some markers. Sometimes I write on the board. I'll get that one. Okay, cool. Great. So I have 2 books in the bookstore. This was in memory to my husband. It's based on the definition of good mental health, which is this triangle, and we're going to be talking about this triangle today. It's just that we can come at change having a clear mind, or we can look at our body, we can look at internal input, or we can look at external. So it's either through change, we can change how we're thinking, we can change how our body is responding through sensation, or we can change our external environment. And I'll talk about it more through examples, but that's the lens even today, and that's the lens that we're coming from usually. But the book, this is a real simple book. I was a caregiver for my husband, and then this is a book on dating. And if you want to have questions about that, feel free to ask me like at meals. You can ask me questions or anything, but I don't want to get too much into it here. I would say my focus is on changing habits and like a dysregulated nervous system, or making people have a healthier nervous system. So I might call that like brain fitness, because I think some people traditionally, they think of psychotherapy as going to someone because you have a problem, but I just think of it as brain fitness, and that we can all achieve our brain's capacity for excellent executive function. Like all of us can get a little further along on the brain fitness track. So I don't see people as kind of deficient, just as like getting closer and closer to a feeling of alignment. Like our brains and bodies are already achieving homeostasis. We already have a level of integration right now. It's just that there's things we can do to improve our level of integration. So that's the model I'm coming from. And I do have some classes online. I'll include a link to those. And then I found that with this, sometimes people weren't really clear about my services. So I'm just going to say I do about 3 main services, and then there's one more that has kind of popped up here. I worked as a social worker for about 10 years, and I'm care manager certified. So I work with people with dementia and older adults, and occasionally there'll be someone who wants a consult related to that. So that's just something on the side. I know lots of information. And if anyone is caregiving a loved one, this aginglifecare.org website, find a provider by zip code. It's like a 4-hire professional daughter or 4-hire social worker. This is a wonderful resource. You can just pay like $150 and do a one-time consult with them to find out like the best nursing homes or the best home care agencies or something like this. So this is just a good resource I always like to tell people about. And then the main thing that I really do is I work on integrating your memory, explicit and implicit. We're going to be working on that today through widening our windows of tolerance. And you can just kind of rewire your brain and make it better. And so that's kind of what I specialize in. And then I also have training in sex therapy. I have about 6 years of training in that. And a resource, again, think insect, but with 2 A's. Asect.org is a great resource if you want to get someone who is really well qualified to talk in the area of sex therapy. And then finally, I do health coaching. I gave a lecture here called The Lazy Vegan. And I also can consult on physical pain. Some of you will see me on crutches, and I have a congenital condition. So those are just side things that people could just do like 30-minute consults with me, and I have good information that I can share with you on those. So, and you can see me on Tuesdays and Fridays, and this kind of specialized, this slide here kind of shows you what I do. This is brain integration. So I give one talk called the Yes Brain, and the Yes Brain is just kind of this, I call it the prefrontal cortex, or the elephant in the rider. Do I have the, yeah, there it is. The elephant in the rider, because what I'm trying to do is getting away from naming too many brain parts, because I think actually in 20 years they're going to find so many more things about the brain that we just don't want to get too hung up on specific, but there are certain regions. There's this, I call it the middle prefrontal cortex, and you'll see a slide later on, which is it's about right here in the brain. And you've got the brain stem, the limbic brain, and this prefrontal cortex area, and all meets here in the middle prefrontal cortex region. And I call that the pilot of your life, because it really does help integrate your nervous system. And you're going to hear me refer to it over and over as the prefrontal cortex, or the rider, like the rider on top of the elephant. So, and that's just the part of you that can do these higher functions. That's what I'm talking about. And if the insight, empathy, attuned communication, the ability to unlearn a fear, fear modulation, all these higher functions involve inhibition. You have to inhibit certain responses in order to think about thinking and get more robust responses. And the way I classify these, you'll see in a minute, I have a big slide, is just, I call all 9 functions response flexibility, which is the ability to pause between impulse and action. So to be the rider, to have a good, strong prefrontal cortex, is to be able to pause between impulse and action, and to think about thinking and to choose. And that's what we're going to be applying today when we're talking about changing our eating habits. It's kind of the difference between being reactive versus responsive. So what you're going to see in my talks, especially for the people who are water fasting, is I might sometimes throw in some larger brain terms, but I always like to bring it back to more simple terms, because you don't have to know all the big attuned communication, or you don't need to know all the big words to just understand that I need to put a pause between impulse and action in order to give myself a little bit of space to kind of live the life I want. You know, that's the main thing that I'm pushing through in my message today. That and the importance of our environment, because when you see the way the brain gets wired up when we're young, it's about 25% developed when we're born. If it was bigger than that, we wouldn't be able to get through the birth canal. But then by age 3, it's about 80% developed, more or less. And our brain, especially the neocortex area, where there's the most neurons here in the prefrontal cortex, it really gets wired up by our social environment. Some of you might have heard that known as attachment theory. But the main message in that is how your brain was wired up in those first 3 years is just really important. And even today, the relational nature of the brain, what your environment is like, what your friendships are like, what your home environment is like, is it pleasing, is it stressful, it really affects your overall physical health and the health of your nervous system. So besides saying there's things we can do to promote neuroplasticity, that's one message, like meditation. My other main message is that how we relate really affects our brain. So you'll see me over and over kind of come back to those 2 messages. So yeah, and then the other thing when I talk about memory integration, they call this the fast systems, because it's like 1/20th of a second, and the slow systems, which was that neocortex area that gets wired up when we're young. And these are like, this slow area is that response flexibility. It's all those higher functions. It's the ability to tell stories, and it's really the slow, because it takes a half second to come online. They call it the crucial half second, because when we are reactive in our life, oftentimes it's this fast or unconscious or somatic memory, implicit memory, that's just rising up in us and causing us to behave in ways we don't want. And I'll have people give examples and I'll name it, but when I first heard this, I got the most massive aha, and this may be the most interesting thing you'll hear during the whole lecture, is that if you're noticing yourself having, it's called a high level of arousal or agitation, like emotional intensity, if you're just suddenly like, nothing really big is going on, but something has happened. I don't know if it was like you heard a splash in a pool or something and you're suddenly like way up here. I would say what could be happening is your implicit memory which is that memory that's like smell. It's related when you're young. It's not, explicit memory is like a photo album, but implicit memory is more like smells and schema, and it's a little bit, it's kind of like a little different, and there are things you need to do to integrate the two. But implicit memory, like if you're noticing yourself having a high level of arousal suddenly, it's not tagged with time. So I'm just, in that example, you suddenly hear someone splash in the pool, and there's nothing really going on, but maybe something happened to you, when you were 7 years old related to a pool, and your nervous system is just way up here. And I would say that's because your implicit memory button is being touched, but your conscious brain isn't like, oh, you're remembering when you were at the pool when you were 7. You only experience it as a higher level of agitation or sensation. So that relates to when we're going to be talking about eating habits, because what will happen is when someone has usually a behavior they don't like, usually preceding it, there's some level, increasingly high level of emotional intensity that then leads to a reason to need to calm down or numb the nervous system. And usually that building up of emotional intensity relates to cues you're getting. They call them cues of danger from your implicit memory. Or some of you might have heard this kind of subconscious or unconscious. I just want to be clear when I'm using certain terms what I'm talking about, what I'm not talking about, because sometimes it can be confusing, like if I use the word subconscious or unconscious. Like if I were to use unconscious, I would just mean below conscious awareness. So I try and be really clear when I use a term, what I mean. And as we go along, if you have a question, you can ask me, and I can define whatever term I'm referring to. So anyway, when we do memory integration, we use, this is the key, you're going to hear me in the lecture today, the way we heal our wonky nervous system is that we use our ability to tell a story, the narrative of our life, and our imagination to heal. So what would happen is, if you're getting triggered by that splash of the pool, you're hearing a cue of danger, and what you can do is you can give yourself cues of safety. So what you can do is you can look over, I'm just thinking of the fountain right now, maybe someone dropped a big rock in it. You can just look over, you can look over at the fountain, you can really consciously say cues of safety, I am safe. You can look around, you can make eye contact with people because we have this called a ventral vagus nerve, and we're mammals, only mammals have this ventral vagus nerve. We orient through our eye contact, through our facial muscles. So whenever you're getting kind of cues of danger, looking to other people's faces will help calm us down. Also tones, people's tones and voice. So just connecting, that's why horses and dogs and cats, they are mammals, so they have that ventral vagus nerve. So that's why I think sometimes when people are traumatized and they can't really regulate good with other human beings, they tend to be able to regulate with animals. So the animals help calm us down because it's that ventral vagus nerve kind of regulating us. So what you're all doing is you're doing this every day all the time. You're doing it right now. Some of you, if you're water fasting, you're trying to regulate your whole body because you've got maybe like 1/10 of like the glucose and brain reserves of other people in the room. So you're trying to regulate your reserves and listen to all the words I'm using, so you're also kind of controlling like your overall level of energy. So we're always doing this regulating that I'm talking about. I'm just kind of talking about it in more detail. And if someone has an example with eating habits, think of it, start thinking about it, because in a minute I'm gonna get about 3 examples, and then we're gonna piggyback around them. So there's 3 things that I think more or less that I want to explain before I take an example from people and we just kind of wing it. The first is what Siegel calls mind sight. Mind sight is like eyesight, but it's a specific skill. Okay, it's being able to see inside your mind, and that's called insight. And it's being able to see in other people's mind, which is empathy. So it's called mind mapping. You make a map of that. So that's just what I just said. Mind sight is where you have insight and empathy. So the mind sight is in this model that he has. This is a wheel of awareness. It's a meditation, but we kind of have this hub of awareness, and we focus our attention on REM activity. Like right now, you're in your body and you're still. If you're feeling more centered and calm, you would be in your hub of awareness, and then your attention, where your attention is going right now, it's going to my words. That would be considered REM activity. And how your mind sight is, you can strengthen, I call it your mind sight muscle. We can do things to strengthen our ability to focus attention and delay response and allocate resources. So those are the three kind of main things that our mind-sight muscle is always doing. So that's one, mind-sight, having mind-sight. And then this is that, I mentioned the 9 functions. This is just the definition of them, and I'll include a link. You don't have to know all this. I'll include a link. I have a link to this on my website. Like I said, I kind of define all 9 of these as just response flexibility, putting a pause between impulse and action. So all of these involve inhibition, inhibiting your initial reaction and thinking about thinking and kind of creating more neural pathways. So that was the main thing, mind sight, response flexibility, and then now we're going to get into this window of tolerance. So these are just 3 terms that you need to know. Everything else we don't need to know. This is what happens in life. I was talking about emotional intensity. Like we have low emotional intensity and then we get stressed out. Everyone here, you're in a new environment, so I would say you're already a little bit up. Just leaving home, which is familiar, and then coming to a new environment, it's always a little bit stressful. Even positive change, like a wedding, is always a little bit stressful. And then for people who have we all find ways to release our stress, but what were some examples of things that you all did once you got here to help yourselves calm down and feel more relaxed? Call someone, okay. What were other things that you did? Sleep, right? Arrive and then just chill out.
Organize the room.
Yeah, unpack the bag. What did you say?
Eat food.
Eat food, yeah. Eat the food here, and eating is it's also a communal experience here. So you actually weren't just eating food. I call it love food instead of attuned communication, or whatever you call it. But yeah, we maybe you connected some, or maybe just eating. If you traveled a lot and you didn't have any food in you, that can cause you to become dysregulated. So all those are just examples of how we're constantly regulating our nervous system, and you're getting charged and you're releasing it, and you're getting charged and you're releasing it. So that's the baseline. This is called your window of tolerance, or your window of welcome, or your resilient zone. It has different names. I call it mostly your window of tolerance. And then what happens is, and I include this slide because some people, when they're in their window of tolerance, they're not really sure what emotions are good emotions versus too much emotions. And I would say you're stimulated, you're motivated, you're challenged, you're engaged. So a lot of people sometimes, I think the hardest ways that we can to change are when we're in boredom and when we're numb. This is kind of called numb, when we're hypo-aroused down here. And it's harder to figure out that you're not in your window of tolerance when you're kind of more numb, because you think everything is okay, but you may not really be feeling, you could call it the pain of life, but it's also the joy of life. So it's a double-edged sword. It's like a coin can be both fear or excitement. I don't know if you guys have heard that. When we're talking about arousal, that's what we're talking about. The joys of emotion. It can be joyful, it can be scary, and we all cope with that in different ways. But numbness is a tricky one. So anyway, those are where we want to be, those emotions. And then what happens is we get a little wonky when extreme things happen to us. It's just the way, when we have a traumatic event, which I just call extreme overwhelm. I try and stay away from certain terms because I think they're trigger words. When we get extreme overwhelm in our lives, a feeling of intense fear, it programs our nervous system where we'll go into hyperarousal, which is kind of like mania or rage or extreme anxiety or panic. That's the hyperarousal. Or you'll go down in this hypoarousal, this depression, and you're kind of disconnected. Some people call this disassociation. But we go wonky between these two things. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about, and it's something invisible, so we'll see as we go along, and I encourage everyone to think about these things when you go back into your rooms and to reflect on it. So this is what I call it, the window of tolerance. Widen your window of tolerance. And then in neurobiology, in neurobiology, we're going to take this model, and we're just going to turn it 90 degrees, and we're going to make it a river. This, it's the only difference. This is a river of neural integration. I call it a river of brain integration. And what happens is you end up on these riverbanks of rigidity and chaos. And an obvious example is someone who, with eating, we'll use eating. What happens at the beginning when they diet? What are they doing at the beginning? When they diet, are they being really structured, or are they being really carefree? Structured, right? So they're very rigid. Rigid. 1,000 calories a day. I'm on top of my game. So they're on the riverbank of rigidity, and then what happens about 6 weeks in? By binging or something, right? Something happens, whatever it is, because in a way, sometimes it's really hard to maintain this extreme rigidity with dieting. That's why diets don't work. So then what would happen is a person would fluctuate on this riverbank of chaos. So what we see, and this is sort of a manifestation of the ways human beings deal with arousal, is we alternate between this rigidity and chaos. So this is kind of just a really amazing, interesting, fundamental model of how we deal with emotional intensity, and each person in the room is going to deal with it differently, but I would say that we could map you on this map. That's sort of my challenge, and I'll do the river real quick and then I'll come back to this just so people can see the river. And so your destination are these 9 functions, these 9 domains, and we all exist on it, we're either low brain integration to high brain integration. So that's the model, the neurobiology model. I'm going to go back to the window of tolerance, but I'm trying to think. I do have, that's hypoarousal and that's numbness, and then that's that same chart, just so you guys can understand. But whether or not it's just a river or whether or not it's here, the key is that we widen our windows of tolerance, or we widen our window so we don't crash onto our riverbanks as quickly as possible. And the way we do that is we make ourselves a bigger boat. We widen the river, and we also, as the river widens, our boat naturally becomes bigger. So I also use this as an analogy of a plane. Like some people have a tinky little 2-person plane, or you can have like a Boeing 737, which is like you can just take the intensity of life or the pain of living, and you don't end up crashing onto the riverbanks of rigidity and chaos. And by growing what the research shows is by growing your mind sight muscle, that's how you get your plane bigger. So that's the main thing we're going to be talking about today. Everyone can grow their plane a little bit bigger, and even a really big plane can just have one little tear in it, which can just render it completely ineffective. So no matter how robust, I would say, you feel like you are, there are always little weaknesses that we can patch and improve on. So I'm going to just come back. I touch on the river just so people understand that, because it's really important. But today we're just going to talk on that. I'm going to get some water, and just think for a minute on your eating habits. If people have examples of when they went onto the riverbanks of rigidity or chaos. Okay. So what are some examples that people have? The brave people who will share, yeah.
Coffee.
Okay.
He doesn't get it.
Uh-huh.
He's done in this very rigid about.
Yeah, and I mean coffee, it's so funny, so it's so easy to go into these kind of meta stories if it's something that's common, like meat eating or coffee or something. So what we have to do is we have to just break it down. We have to step away from trying to go into a meta story about it. And what we want to do is we just have to look at the individual body and the responses from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed. So with coffee, what would it be? Yeah, so there would be a need for it, and without it, there's chaos.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a perfect example. And caffeine, we know, is addictive. There's the thing about all this, and you'll see me come over and over and over to this. Caffeine is shown to be somewhat good for other things. You'll see lots of studies that try and make it good. And my thing is nothing is good or bad in and of itself. It's like how you're using it. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we label the thing that we're working with as bad. So you'll see me, I'm constantly kind of reorienting the conversation a little bit, because when we judge, we're coming from the elephant, and we're doing more judging and black-white thinking. When we're in curiosity, we're in that rider. We're in that prefrontal cortex. So what I would do is, for anyone in the room, for any issue, because I'm sure we could go around the room and every single one of you could say something. So we know what we don't want, because that's how the elephant is, but it's much harder to know what we do want. So the first thing we want to do is, instead of judging the behavior, what we want to do is we want to get curious about it. So I say, everyone in the room, you want to be like Sherlock Holmes, and you just want to get real curious about the behavior, and that helps. Having curiosity helps with the response flexibility. So curiosity is a big tip you can, and I would say friendly curiosity. So not just curiosity, but friendly curiosity. And I'll do a slide in a minute that says why we want to be friendly, because the kindness is really important for soothing the stress response and helping us get access to the rider.
Is that self-curiosity?
Self-curiosity. Yeah, in that case, doing it with yourself and then doing it with someone else, either way. So caffeine is a perfect example. I mean, I could just go through this whole thing just with the person with coffee. So, so is it a normal habit where you do it every day?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then, the thing is even if it was something like benign, like making your bed every day, if you were to stop making your bed, what the body does, it's called top-down thinking versus bottom-up thinking. And top-down thinking is like group of 30 people done, hiding, giving a PowerPoint, reading the PowerPoint, done. So what our brain does is, in order to conserve energy, is it just labels things, and then you'll know when you're talking to someone who's doing top-down. A lot of healthcare professionals will do this. They'll get a little bit kind of lazy, and it's just the way the brain, we go to top-down thinking as we get older, unless we specifically do something different, because we're conserving energy. So like in your model, like what I'm trying to take a step away from with the caffeine is just saying, you're talking about changing a habit that you do every day. So that's like going from top-down thinking to bottom-up thinking. Bottom-up thinking is like, I'm noticing that I'm having the experience of the room. I'm not labeling, and I'm feeling kind of like a buzzing energy. It's a very different feeling when I go to a place of bottom-up thinking rather than top-down thinking. So that would be my first tip for everyone, besides kind of curiosity. Because what we're doing is I always talk, you're looking here and you're doing here. You're shifting brain states. So first be curious, then bottom-up thinking. What's going on in your body before you drink the coffee, and as you drink the coffee, and an hour after you drink the coffee? And I mean, the main thing is like, do you want that to be different?
No.
Yeah. So what I would say is, when we're talking about brain change, the first thing we have to do, now how do you feel about it? Do you want it to be different?
Yeah, because he has about 30 cups a week.
Yeah.
And even if we go to the mall, he'll track down Nescafe and go and have free coffee at the mall. Like, he's obsessed with coffee. And also, just from the quality of things, coffee actually thickens your arteries, and also
It actually can, caffeine can cause your cholesterol to go up.
Yeah, cholesterol and
Yeah.
blood pressure, and he's wanting to decrease his blood pressure, so he knows he wants he knows he wants to.
Well, but that's not what he answered. I take people at face value. Yeah, and we can, this is kind of the process of change, is being curious, and when we have these really ingrained habits, this is a perfect example of change. Okay, so we're on a pathway. It's familiar to us. Part of us maybe wants to do something else, and part of us doesn't. We're basically just split. We'll just call it like 50-50. And okay, the first thing I'll say when I'm working with people is I find out the motivation, because I'll just say a little statement, and I think it's important. I say, because I used to give a lot of talk to seniors, I said at age 25, guess how many times a person has to repeat something to create a new neural pathway in the brain?
16.
16, 40 times, okay? This is a healthy 25-year-old. A healthy 85-year-old, how many times do you think they have to repeat something to create a new neural pathway in the brain? I've never had anyone say 2,000, that's funny. Usually people will say like 80, they'll be like 40, 80, you know? But the answer is 400. But this is the reason I brought this whole thing up. The issue is not whether the person has to repeat it 40 times or 400 times. The issue is the motivation. That's the dopamine, that's the love food for ourselves, that's the love food for other people, that's the attunement within, the attunement with others. It's dong, it's a resonance. There's something that needs to happen that aligns us from here to here. That it's like a vision. So there has to be something that motivates us. So that would be the first thing, finding the motivation.
So the motivation is reduced blood pressure.
Right.
Which is, I know, something very dear to everyone.
Yeah. So I'm a little hesitant to use this example because it seems like ambivalent, and I don't necessarily want to bring it up in the whole room. Are you okay to talk about it?
You want the caffeine taste and the initial effect, as
Yeah.
we all know it wears off.
Yeah.
But then you do have the high blood pressure.
Yeah.
But it's still the taste, the sensation of the coffee that you want.
It is.
So the mind can't see the blood pressure, but the mind knows the taste.
Right. So what we always do, we call this breaking down the cravings sometimes. And you'll see over and over in my lecture, good brain health is all about, it's called differentiation and linkage. That's the definition for integration. Differentiation and linkage. So for everyone in the room, if you're having a problem, you're going to say, like, am I differentiating, which means separating. Am I differentiating too much or am I linking too much? And you'll see me in my lectures explain this more, because in the beginning when you hear this, it doesn't make sense. But for you, what you're going to want to do is you have this thing of coffee, but there's the taste of coffee and then there's the caffeine of coffee. So what we want to do is we want to differentiate the two. So you can actually get like caffeine pills, for example. You can cut them in quarters because they come in like 200 milligram tablets. When you cut them in quarters, it's maybe like 40 milligrams, which is like the equivalent of a cup of tea. And then you can figure out, you could get decaffeinated coffee, and then, so there's all kinds of things you could do to play with it in a way that makes sense. I'm not advocating the use or the not use of caffeine, I'm talking about problem solving something. And you could kind of try and figure out, like, what's the minimum amount of caffeine that you need, and what's the minimum amount of coffee, because there's other things, there's something called Ticino, which is made with hazelnut. Some people like it, some people don't. Chicory root, it's like a coffee replacement, and some people do 50% coffee, 50% of this Ticino mix. So there's alternative coffee. There's coffee made with dandelion root. Does taste kind of coffee-like, but probably not for people who are really into coffee, So sometimes we really just want that one thing. And so that's just the beginning of it, because you have to figure out what the problem is. And what I recommend is that you play, and this is true for everyone's issues, you have to play with your relationship with it. You have to come to know yourself as resilient, which is that response flexibility. So having, and getting off of caffeine is its own thing. So kind of getting off of the addiction of caffeine, and then what I would say is, like, it's so much more. The thing is, we think it's the issue, we think the coffee is the issue, but it's like, what is the coffee doing for you that's really the issue? Because what happens is, we oftentimes have a lot of stress in our lives, we have a lot of things we're managing in our lives, and it's these other things like eating that give us dopamine and calm us down. So they're satisfying us. So what I would say as an alternative view is the coffee the problem, or is it all the things that are causing your emotional intensity or arousal to go higher and higher? Because as an alternative theory, if you didn't have all those things making your emotional intensity go higher and higher, you may find that the coffee consumption may just completely change on its own. So that's it. Like, they call that crowding out as a theory. I totally recommend it. So what that is, if you have something like your equivalent of coffee and it's with food, whatever it is that you eat like half a head of cauliflower before you have that thing. Yeah, it's called crowding out. And you could do the same thing with coffee. You know, you could just drink 16 ounces of water before you drink the coffee. That's a crowding out theory. But you're still kind of dealing with the same thing. So that's one. What I want to do is I want to have maybe 3 examples. I'm going to bounce between them. So
What about a habit like chewing your fingernails?
Yeah, that's another perfect example. What you want to do is, what I would say, and then let's do one more example. Chewing fingernails, yeah.
Well, actually, I have a question about the rigidity in terms of the diet at True North. Seems very, very rigid, but you're saying you don't want to be in rigidity.
Yeah.
So that's one part of my question. And then my own thing is being able to eat the diet at home, but then when I go out, I can't say no at friends' houses to a little cheese or a little whatever.
Okay.
And I find, and the same at restaurants, you know, when I'm eating with friends, and for me, I think it goes back to a kind of arrogant self-concept that, oh, I'm not a rigid, dogmatic person. I'm this free, flexible person. And so I'm like expressing that in my, in breaking the diet in these little ways. But then over time I found that my symptoms of my chronic disease did get worse because I was eating more and more cheese.
Yes,
and
so
all
that's
that.
2 pieces of information. So this is actually a good example of, you know, you've got this one way and then you're getting more data. And when a mind is functioning properly, what's happening is, in my model, in the neurobiology model, the mind is more than the brain. The brain is like a file system of stored information, like a library stack. That's the brain, that you retrieve the file. But the mind is constantly getting more data, both inside and outside your body. So what's happening is that you're having this kind of way of adapting your eating habits when you're at home, when you're in your social environment. It's flowy, it depends. We can break it down, which we will in a minute. But what's happening is your mind is giving yourself new data about, oh, as my life progresses, I'm still having symptoms. So a good functioning mind is able to take in the data, get rid of what is not relevant, and keep what is relevant. That's called allocating resources. And then it's able to delay response and focus attention. So we're talking about our optimal use of our resources. And the key is, like, where are you getting tripped up? So I'm just going to ask some questions just to see where you are on it. If you could wave a magic wand and be however you wanted, when you go into social settings, would you prefer to just stick with your diet, or do you want to kind of cheat a little?
I would love to cheat, but if it didn't cause symptoms.
Yes.
And maybe it comes. Maybe it's also because I don't want people to think that I'm so uptight or something.
Okay.
That might be part of it too.
Okay. So
Like
your
my
answer.
little, cooler with my own food or whatever I
Right.
need to do. It
Right.
just seems so dorky.
One thing I really like to legitimize, because this is not being shared in the vegan community, is that the way you're feeling is so important. It's so important to acknowledge, because we are tribal. We're like parades of elephants or bees. We orient according to our social tribe. And when you're vegan and everyone else is eating differently, you're immediately perceived as an outsider and a threat. So you're basically like, this is just an analogy, but like in a room full of Christians, you're like the Muslim. So when that happens, you get all this like pointed at you, having nothing to do with you. So by choosing to be different, you're taking on a burden, and you're actually voicing that burden, and I'm just voicing that burden to normalize it. And that's actually a strategy that we can all use. It's called common humanity. And I don't really like the word common humanity. It's interesting. All it means is that if you're starting to feel isolated, that is what the elephant loves to do to make you feel more stressed out and closed down. And to narrow your window of tolerance. So the way we widen our window of tolerance is we remind ourselves that we're not isolated and alone, and we think of other people. So what you would do is, being dorky, carrying your thing, you would think of someone else somewhere in the world right now who's dorkily carrying their thing in another, and you would really, I mean, I would go in the bathroom and you would breathe it in, and you would have that experience of talking to the person, you would hug them, and you'd muscle it and be like, we're gonna go out, we're gonna be dorky together. And what that does is that orients you to safety with that ventral vagus nerve. It's so important that we feel like we have a community and we belong. And I'm not saying that this is easy, but I'm talking about kind of the techniques when you look at the way our nervous system works. We have to feel like we have a feeling of belonging and purpose, and we make a contribution. So that'd be the first thing, is to think of common humanity. But your answer, I was like, if I could wave a magic wand and you could behave any way you want, how would you want to behave? You know, your answer reflects actually how you are currently behaving. So it's not, you are actually ambivalent about what behavior you want to choose. So the first thing we have to do is we have to get clear on our behavior. And in my Neuroscience of Dating book, all these principles are in my Neuroscience. Chapter 1 is clarity. And I have a chapter on rigidity versus clarity, like when you're dating, but it applies to other things too. And I hear what you're saying about the diet seeming very rigid, but there's freedom in knowing who you are, what your values are, and one of those 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex is morality, which is kind of a mind map of us. And I would say choosing this diet eventually, if it becomes a part of who you are and it's something that you consistently do over time, it links up with one's morality in the sense that it doesn't feel restrictive, although it can, I understand what you're saying, but it's actually, out of all the different choices that I can make as a human being, this is my choice, and you can have a feeling of centeredness around it. But I think where the oppression comes in is not that individual sense of self-confidence that you can have about the choice you're making, but when other people around you, when you're the Muslim in the room of Christians, right, then you can suddenly feel much less proud about your choice when you're faced with all the ire, which again, because we're social creatures, like when you think of bullying and the effects of bullying and stuff, it can weigh us down. It's not an easy thing to be all proud and self-confident. So again, it's really important that we find a tribe or feeling of belonging, and that we repeatedly have experiences of that to normalize our choice so we don't feel like an outsider and we don't internalize the experience of being an outsider, because that's like shame in a way. And that will cause us to behave in ways we don't. So what we're working with, and the thing about shame is, shame and disassociation, they're these really unconscious mechanisms we learn when we're very young, and it's that part of that implicit memory I was talking about. So I would just say, based on how you're describing what's going on, is that so the difference is there's healthy guilt, there's unhealthy guilt, and then there's shame. And we have to differentiate, I would say, when a person is having this issue about choices, particularly food choices, as it relates to other people, usually there could be an element of the shame thing coming in. So that's why I'm bringing it in as a suggestion for everyone in the room. And I have a handout that I will include in the email for everyone that differentiates healthy guilt, unhealthy guilt, and shame, which I think is really interesting. Shame is like there's something wrong with me, whereas healthy or unhealthy guilt is, and I would say it's, when people are staring at you and you're feeling dorky, right, how do we manage that arousal without losing our window of tolerance? And what we have to do is we have to grow resourced. What we're getting cues of danger from other people, and what we need to do is we need to give ourselves cues of safety. The easiest cue of safety is to have another person who's eating like us with us. Okay, so that, again, you're going to see me over and over make that recommendation of our social environment, because our brains are cued because we're tribal to look around us. So the easiest solution is, so like for you, the easiest thing for you to do would be literally only be surrounded by people who are not drinking coffee. Because the thing that you want to do just becomes more normalized. You have a question, yeah?
Yeah, no, I just was going to say that I found when I left here last time with my weird eating, that my friends, when they saw it when we went out, they were like, when I explain the tremendous results I've had and the weight I've lost, they see how different I look. They were so interested.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking, oh, he's weird or anything, they're like, because most people are sick when they're older. And so it caused such great conversations.
Wow, that's great.
And so rather than feeling weird about it, now I enjoy being proud of it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and I would say that would be, there's systems of thought that talk about how when something becomes, we're talking about change, all this is change, and when something is new versus when something becomes more like part of our value system and then how we relate to it, it's all just like, it's all sort of a process, and wherever anyone is in it, I would just say celebrate where you are in it, because a big mistake we all make is when we try and make ourselves be somewhere different than where we are, and I do this with people when I'm working with their nervous systems, is that your nervous system is like brilliant right now. It's even like the way you're eating, the way you're managing your social situation is brilliant. But what we want to do, because your body's always achieving homeostasis every day, and I understand you have a condition that you're fighting against, so there's different factors, but the system itself is always seeking to achieve homeostasis and doing a fantastic job every second of every day. In the same way that your heart is beating, your nervous system is seeking to regulate itself. But what we want to do is we just want to improve on that. And I would say that is not something that we're taught. In the same way that we're not taught how a vegan diet reverses heart disease, we're not taught the tools that I'm describing today, which can clearly clear the blood vessels of your nervous system so that they flow easier and fuller. Like this, the skills I'm giving today are scientifically as validated as the vegan and the heart healthy diet, but sadly, it's just not being communicated down to the general public. So the main reason I'm saying this is like, the cool thing is, just like you're making the efforts to change your diet, you will find that you have more resources available to you to change your nervous system, because the vegan diet clears up toxins out of your body, and then you'll have more resources to think about thinking, to have executive function. You know, you won't have that neuroinflammation that comes when you have dairy. You know, there have been other talks that have talked about the effects of eating the animal products. So just eating the vegan diet is going to clear you up enough so you have clearer thinking. And then the next step is, and I think some of you are there, it's like level 2. You've got level 1, like figuring out the diet. Level 2 is kind of like just dancing in the world, where you're just kind of, where you're different, and finding a way to do it enjoyably, even when it's like someone is that, what is that dancing where you run into each other? Yeah. Did you have a question? Yeah.
I was just wondering where your computer is.
It's
The email one?
Oh, did it go around?
No, move it
Oh,
Hand it
Kinda
up.
stalled out.
thank you. Yeah, we'll have it go around this side. Is it? Sometimes it falls asleep. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, in the back.
I have a comment.
Okay.
That might help this woman, and that is Stephen Jobs was a vegan, and I doubt anybody pushed him out of the crowd when he went out to eat. Stephen Jobs, the founder
Yeah,
of Steve
yeah, yeah, and so that, what I would call that is, everyone here, you can think of a support team, a circle of support. I call it your superhero team. And so for you, you could put Stephen Jobs on your circle of support. When you look at him, when you think of him, somehow it does something that's a cue of safety. That's an example of cue of safety for you. Everyone in the room is going to have different cues of safety, but that's a perfect example of a cue of safety. Yeah.
I just want to say I really appreciate her point, because many of us definitely have felt that way.
Yeah.
I think it's an important thing to bring out, and I actually really like your response of translating, rather than rigidity, that it's a clarity.
Yeah.
That I felt like you married that very well, and what I have to remind myself, and whether it feels rigid or whether it feels clear, depends on how committed I am to the actual wisdom of this.
Okay.
And what I have to remember is that it's not rigid, because that makes you feel like you're going to snap. It is staying true in the face of a diseased society.
Yeah.
And while it is natural and normal to want to be in the center of the herd, that's what our social wisdom tells us to do. The center of the herd is also filled with disease. And I also like your advice about making your normal amongst other people, because I have no doubt that people gave Steve Jobs all sorts of shit about being vegan. He just said, okay, give me shit.
Yeah.
And we do need, like, people, I've been talking to people about how Facebook has been crucial for me in this. And people go, oh, I don't go on Facebook for this and this and this reason. I go, well, get rid of those reasons,
Right.
but I go on for this.
Just
I
for
never
that,
would have found True North. I said, because that's where I need to put my normal.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to necessarily find it in my day-to-day. I'm going to be surrounded by people who I love very much and who are on the verge of heart attacks.
Yeah.
I'm surrounded by people who aren't living their own truth
Yeah.
vis-a-vis the other issues around actually ethical veganism, but just merely the way of eating itself, or whole food plant-based. What is normal is to be diseased. And so to actually stay strong in that is not easy. But it does, like you're saying, it does eventually become a part of your inner nature.
Yeah.
And you have to create your own social, you have to reach out beyond
Yeah.
to, artificially, to create that new herd.
I agree.
Include into your
I
herd.
like how you heard also what, because you asked multiple questions and I don't know if I totally answered all of them. So you're right, I did kind of do the clarity versus rigidity. I kind of addressed it.
That's because
Yeah.
rigidity feels like snapping,
Uh-huh.
right? And I think it comes down to whether it makes sense to you and whether, whether it
Also
speaks
how
to
you
your inner
communicate
wisdom.
it, like I
Yeah.
talk about integration being differentiation and linkage. So for
Yeah.
me, the way I communicate how I eat with someone
Yeah.
is we eat a lot of the same foods. That's the linkage. And there's some foods that you eat that I don't eat. That's the differentiation. And that's all I say about it. I don't say anything else. That's the linkage and the differentiation for me. And I try and focus on what we share in common. If thinking about people orbiting around a diseased society helps you stick true to your values, I wouldn't want to take that away from you. But what I will say is, at a certain point of integration, what we want to do is we want to, that framework works for us in making certain choices, but ultimately I would say what we want to do is we just want to see people as seeking to achieve homeostasis with the information they have, doing the best they can, and stepping away from judgment and being more in curiosity. When you look at the brain science that I'm coming from, it's not that one is right or wrong. We need our ability to discern and figure out where we are and orient in time and space. But when you look at the 9 domains of integration and you get to a higher state of integration, you see people who've achieved that 9th domain. There's a greater feeling of altruism and a connectedness of all life. And when we judge people, we kind of excessively differentiate ourselves from other people. And there can be a way that, and I do this all the time. So I mean, I'm just like everyone else. But there's a way that we kind of separate ourselves from other people, and that can actually lead us to a feeling of isolation and loneliness, even though the intention is to differentiate from this group and link to this other group, which is super intelligent.
Yeah, and I wasn't necessarily saying that the people were emotionally diseased. I
Yeah.
was saying that their characters
Yeah,
were
their
diseased.
diet, exactly. Their
And I
behaviors.
know that absolutely everyone, or I believe that most everyone, is doing their best with the information that they have been given up to this point.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and that connection is important.
and there's a lot of
But-
misinformation.
But
yeah.
there's a lot of misinformation, and so it's merely, that behavior manifests itself in disease. And to often cling on to and keep justifying that
Right.
way of eating, one sometimes has to bend one logic
Yeah.
around that, and
Yeah.
that's where that comes at one.
I
when those
think people are
this
doing,
way.
so we've got your example was good, just fingernail biting. Then yours was being in the restaurant, and yours was the caffeine. So what I wanted to do, just in the time we have, was talk about what happens when something happens in all 3 of those examples, even when you're biting fingernails, although the question is whether or not the person feels like the biting the fingernails is a problem. Do you bite your fingernails?
Yes.
Okay. Do you feel like it's a problem?
Yes.
Okay, so the thing is again, it's the motivation, because if you don't think that there's a problem, then you're definitely not going to change. So that's always like the beginning point. Yeah, so you want to change, but then there's something that prevents you from being able to
It's
do
an
it.
unconscious thing.
Yeah. It just happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what I would say is for all 3 of you, and the thing is, even the most benign seeming, all the way to the most extreme seeming behavior like addiction to heroin or anything, you're interestingly enough, you're still using the same mechanisms. The difference is how entrenched the addiction is. And when you have chemicals involved, like cheese has those casomorphins in them, which stick on those morphine receptors. So, I mean, and the caffeine is, again, extremely addictive. And you probably started biting your nails when you were really young.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I call it the superhighway. The axons and dendrites of your neurons from childhood are thicker, and there are more of them. So what happens is we just go towards that highway. And you'll see this talk next week in my Neurobiology for Change. I call it paving your dirt road when you're doing neuroplasticity. So to change is like to go down a dirt road, and to just bite your fingernails is like a super highway.
Okay.
So the first thing you want to do is when you're finding yourself engaging in the behavior is you do compassion. Yeah. I haven't found, there's like self-compassion exercises. And what I call it, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to keep it more clinical so people understand the importance of it. Sometimes people hear the word compassion and they think it relates to, this one. This has been my new favorite slide for everyone. What happens is we get threatened in all three of these examples. Like I said, that arousal is going up, we're getting more emotional intensity, and we're trying to manage it. And then what happens is we have to do something about it. I'm starting to feel more stress. I'm going to have a cup of coffee, and I'm going to have that caffeine, which is going to affect my stress. And then I'm feeling stressed out, and I'm going to bite my fingernails. So, and I'm feeling stressed out, and I'm just going to eat like my friends, and I'm going to have a feeling of belonging. So what the neuroscience shows is that we actually need to cultivate the soothing system in order to get access to the writer more. When we give ourselves self-compassion, we calm down, it's called GABA-goo, the amygdala, and we have more access to executive function. So that's where the self-compassion comes in. So you can do, it's called diaphragmatic breathing, where you breathe in, and then you do pursed lips and you breathe out like. And when you do that, it causes your exhale to be long. Because when you breathe in, it's like sympathetic, and when you breathe out, it's parasympathetic. The breath is kind of the doorway to help regulate your nervous system. So when you do that diaphragmatic breathing, and you can Google diaphragmatic breathing and see examples of it, the most important thing, however you do it, is the pursed lips that make you have a long, slow exhale. And giving yourself a long, slow exhale causes you to go more in the parasympathetic state. And then what I'm suggesting, besides changing your breathing, is that you also blow kindness on yourself. In the same way that a mother would just blow like hydrogen peroxide on a knee, and make it bubble up, like just, or the same way that a mom would just blow on a baby's eyelashes. So you conjure up an image that brings about even more a feeling of softness and gentleness, and you blow that on yourself when you're craving the coffee, when you're about to bite your fingernails, when you're about to feel like you have to socially belong and you're going to eat that piece of cheese. You just start doing that breathing. So that's something you can do invisibly. No one does it. And all these, the common humanity and the self-compassion, what it does is it differentiates from the craving, and it links up more towards your vision. So the key is self-awareness. It really is. And so there were two things I said I was going to include in the handout. I'm trying to remember what that second. Do people remember what I was going to include? So I have something called a self-compassion break. It's a handout. It basically says these three things. First, you become aware. Then you give yourself some self-compassion. Then you do common humanity. And I've just explained it here. But that is a wonderful resource and tool if you're starting to have any kind of craving to try and reprogram your brain. I'll remember. I think I'll come back. I'll listen to the recording and I'll go back, because I remember I said something that I would include something else in the beginning. So I was what I wanted to do was go back on this and just talk about what happens when we start to when we lose executive function. So you're in your window of tolerance as long as you have access to response flexibility. So the definition of being here or here is you no longer have kind of control of your emotions in the sense that they overtake you and you start screaming, or you just become numb and shut down, and sometimes both can be going on at the same time. So it's not so easy to figure it out. sometimes what can happen, like for example, when we eat a certain way in a social environment, is we can start to get really stressed out, and then we can get so overwhelmed with the decision that we actually go numb, and then we make the choice to eat. So there could be like lots of things going on, and so the first thing I would do for each of us is to break it down. What's happening in this moment? Like if I could circle this, I would right here, because this is when you're starting in that moment, when you're starting to dip onto, and I would say most of the time when I break it down, I don't really have time, but when I try and break it down with people, I'll try, what was your name?
Oh, Rebecca.
Rebecca. So when it happens, can you think of one time, just to make it easier, where it happened, where you were eating, and you kind of didn't want to be eating, but you did, within a social group?
And yes,
Okay.
at my friend's house, and it also has to do with wanting to be nice and not reject something
Yeah.
that's offered. So salad that had feta cheese.
Yeah.
I was just like, a little bit of feta cheese.
Yeah.
That's not gonna.
So can you think of what was going on for you right before that happened?
I was hungry.
Okay, so all of this is, what is it that causes us to edge us closer to our window of tolerance? And I would say the number one, based on science, you cannot argue with me, the number one things you can do to manage your body budget, which is your limbic system and your reserves and your homeostasis, the number one things you can do is get enough sleep, get enough exercise, right, and manage your stress levels, just in general. Sleep, exercise, and eating. Sleep, exercise, eating, because that gives you like the biggest fuel tank you possibly can. So absolutely, those are things that trip us up. So we know that when our system becomes more weak, we're more likely to, and what we want to do is we don't want to judge ourselves so much, because we all kind of end up on these riverbanks, but we want to kindly and gently reorient our boat back down the river of integration. And later on, we want to give ourselves kindness, and we really want to break it down and figure out where was the weakness. We want to support ourselves to figure out we want to set ourselves up to win. So that was a perfect example, actually your example, that you were hungry beforehand. And what I would say is oftentimes when it happens, when we cross the line, it is not conscious. I would argue that it's actually implicit memory arousal spiking up from the unconscious to the conscious. And the only way we know we're here or here is by the behavior. So again, we know what we don't want. People can raise their hands and talk about the behavior, but they don't know the most important piece of information, which is what happened to get them from here to here. And breaking it down. What is happening? How am I responding to my nervous system becoming... So whenever we're in a social environment, and I do it when people come to see me in the office, I just have them take a minute and settle in. Whenever we're in transition, we know our nervous system is just going to be a little more stressed out. So if you're going to a social environment, you know already you're going to be a little more weak, just a little more weak. So you know you got to prepare yourself, which is why you carry the box of stuff and everything. Another thing you can do, and then I'll end it just because I don't want this to go on for too long for the people who are water fasting. Another thing you can do, which I've more learned about recently, is called pronking. Because I find this group tends to be quite a talented group. I find I tend to be preaching to the choir, and I think sometimes by nitpicking some of the problems that we have, we're not really looking at the tremendous success and admiration I have for every single person in the room. That we are such a small minority of people, and what we're doing is just so important. And for me, if I could, I would almost like to just spend like 95% of the class just celebrating that and pronking, and then just 5% focusing on the problem, because our way of thinking actually perpetuates the problem in the first place. And that was the thing where I was talking about coming from judging versus coming from curiosity. When we're more in curiosity, we're more in celebration, we're pronking. So what I'll have everyone do is, what pronking is Rams do it. So you know this by football players, you know, when they take a touchdown and they take the football and they throw it on the ground, right? And then they pronk. That's what pronking is. Rams do it. And you're celebrating. So maybe a high five might be an example. So what I want everyone to do is just turn to the person next to you and pronk the fact that you're at true north. I'm at true north. I made it. Pronkin. So everyone try this. Try kind of sticking your chest out. True north. That's the fun part. It's kind of, you see, and the feeling in your body and pronking. So that's actually something else. Instead of thinking about the problem you're having, if you can just celebrate all the good things you're doing, I think that's part of it. Because sometimes if we nitpick ourselves, then it sort of perpetuates that shame a little bit too. So I want to help problem solve. These are important issues, but if we can kind of pay attention to all the good things we're doing, and that's what a good filter does. Again, it takes in the relevant information and it lets go of the bad information. So I'll end with that. You've got the small intestines, you have the microvilli, and they take in the nutrients, and they poo out all the bad, and they keep what's good, and it circulates through your system. So a good mind is like that too. It takes in all the data, people saying weird things to you, all the food information out there, and when you get a good working system internally, you can take all that information and you store it. You get rid of all the stuff that's not important to you, and you have a vision, and you're clear, and you do these sorts of things called cues of safety, like pronking and self-compassion. You give yourself cues of safety when you're starting to go down your ladder, you're seeing cues of danger, and you're getting more stressed out. So that was sort of an introduction to me. Thank you. Thank you.